well, good morning for those of you on the West Coast, good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and welcome to today's live. My name is Brooke Kelly, and I will be going live every Tuesday at 9:30 Pacific Standard Time. And my intention is to share wisdom and best practices that I've had the privilege of learning and sharing for the last 17 years as a coach to some of the most successful financial advisors and leadership on Wall Street. So thank you for being here. This live is not just though for financial advisors, although there will certainly be value there. The live is for anyone who's in a consultative selling field, who is an entrepreneur looking to grow or scale a team, any individual who's looking to up-level their communication skills, and specifically, as I mentioned, anyone in a consultative selling field will definitely benefit from these lives. And I welcome any of your questions and comments. Many of you emailed in after last week's live, which was great to see some feedback, and I appreciate it. And a lot of this week's questions seem to begin to take a look at why you can or can't land a client. And I'm going to read one of the questions that came in, or a couple of the questions. So the first question is, why does EQ or emotional intelligence matter so much more than IQ after a certain level of success? And then a specific question was, I can't break through with my opening reach out to secure a new client. What do you feel I'm doing wrong? What are some ways I should be showing EQ or emotional intelligence? And then the final question is, I have all of this data that shows why working with me will get you further in your current business situation, but I still can't land the client. What am I doing wrong? So first and foremost, let's just take a look at the difference between IQ and EQ when you're talking about a selling scenario. Typically, IQ is what most people lead with, particularly when they're in a consultative selling environment, a more sophisticated sales environment. People assume that occurring as more intelligent will be more effective. And it's certainly never a good idea not to occur as intelligent. But when that's what you're leading with, and that's essentially all that you're relying on, or the majority of what you're relying on, that is where you begin to water down your efficacy or your ability to cut through, because now you're competing with a lot of other IQ smart people for the same opportunities and clients. So the first thing to take a look at is IQ is really where you are leading with solutions that are typically part of your agenda before you've even engaged in any level of discovery, which is where the beginning of EQ would start to take place. So IQ is a lot of solutions. It doesn't typically take into account any discovery or uncovering the person's needs and wants. And it's typically going to occur more like a very polished commercial with a lot of intelligent reasons why someone should buy from you, choose this solution. Again, that's not bad. It's just when we take a look at the timing or the sequence of when to bring IQ, what I found to be more effective in a consultative selling environment is to lead with EQ. Meaning if you take a look at any sales interaction or any relationship in business, there are 4 stages that one must master. The first is the phase that we would refer to as leverage. This is where the client or the prospect, in this case, the prospect is deciding whether or not they find you to be credible. So in the leverage phase, the prospect is asking the question, are you credible? The second phase, which occurs immediately after that, is the rapport phase. And after someone has decided that you're credible, the next thing they want to know is, do they like you? So in the rapport phase, the prospect is in an inquiry around, do I like you? After the leverage and rapport phase, phase 3 is what we would refer to as the relationship phase. And this is where the prospect is deciding, do I trust you? The final phase is the recommendation phase. And this is where they're deciding if they like, trust, and find your recommendation to be credible. So this is where they're deciding, do I want to buy your recommendation or what you're selling, put quite simply. So we've got leverage, rapport, relationship, and then the pitch. When we talk about people exerting more EQ, the first thing that a person who's using EQ would do is they would understand these 4 phases of the sales cycle, and they would know these inside and out. They would understand how to establish leverage or credibility without occurring as off-putting. Many of us have been in environments where there's an individual who is really good at establishing their credentials. The only problem is they're so good at it that by the time they're done, you'd like to get as far away from them as possible because they're really great at establishing leverage. But in the process, you're put off by them. So there's a fine balance when you're establishing leverage or your credibility, that you're able to do this without occurring as self-absorbed, as full of yourself, or without having the emotional intelligence to balance that. As you're establishing leverage, you need to be keeping your eye on the next phase, which is rapport. So once you've established that you're credible, and again, remember that credible means credible in the eyes of the individual who's engaged in the analysis or the evaluation of you. So credibility for most people is what they think makes them important. What makes you credible to others is typically in a consultative selling environment where your unique expertise is a direct match for their pain. So when we take a look at this in a medical environment, right? Not to bring up an upsetting issue, right? But if I have cancer, I don't want a dermatologist. Doesn't matter how esteemed or accomplished this dermatologist is. What I need is an oncologist and probably a team of others, right? So that is a very specific example that people can relate to and say, yeah, that makes rational sense. But when we're talking about what you do, it's not always feeling as cut and dry, and it is actually, quite frankly, as cut and dry. So when you're establishing leverage, you want to be sure that you're establishing your credentials in relationship to that person's pain, not their pleasure. At this point, what we want to solve for them is what would take them out of pain. Which credentials you have that would most resolve their pain. That's what would give you credibility. As you're establishing that, understand that the very next phase is rapport. And during the rapport phase, what you want to do is be sure that you are addressing both verbally and non-verbally, and that's the key, that 90% of rapport is non-verbal. So when you're establishing rapport with another, they're they're analyzing your grooming, they're analyzing your gestures, they're analyzing the tone of your voice, the volume of your voice, the speed at which you speak. All of these things, the non-verbal, make up 93% of the degree to which this person decides whether or not they like you. The other 7%, you can certainly royally screw that up with the verbal, because that is the other 7%. But what's important to understand is that when you are in that second phase of rapport, 93% of what has a person decide that they like you is not about the words that come out of your mouth. And that tends to be so much of what we all focus on, right? We get degrees, we get advanced degrees. When we're preparing for something, the first thing that we think is, what am I going to say? And yes, it's important sometimes to quiet the mind to know what you're going to say. But when we're really talking about the science of rapport, it is much more about the nonverbal connection, communication that you have with this individual. So let's assume that you were effective at establishing leverage or credibility. Then the next thing that you want to be effective at is establishing rapport, which we've now clarified is primarily nonverbal. Once you've established leverage and rapport, you're going to take that cumulative score into the third phase, which is what we refer to as the relationship phase. And this is where the prospect is asking, do I trust you? You being the salesperson on the other side. So remember, they may feel that you have enough leverage to allow you to advance to the rapport phase, and then you might have a decent amount of rapport. But if you come into that third phase with only a small amount that is sufficient, but still small, of both leverage and rapport, by the time you get into this third phase around trust, this is where you're going to be punished. Meaning they're not going to readily answer the questions that you would have that would allow you to establish a greater degree of trust. So in this third phase, this is where a lot of people decide to talk and to pitch prematurely. I always say that nothing a man does prematurely is good. And I say that not to be provocative, but because it's memorable. And in this case, nothing a man or a woman, meaning pitching prematurely is never a good idea. In this third phase, the trust phase, this is where you want to have a series of thoughtful questions that are authentic, that don't feel robotic, that don't have this individual feel like they're on the witness stand. But what you want to be uncovering in this third phase is, where's their pain? What do they value? How are they going to object to you in the future? So pain, values, and future objections. Inside of all of that, what people are going to be telling you is what they're buying. Meaning, rather than you deciding what you're selling, listen to what they're buying. Not because you won't decide to sell them what you want to sell them in this fourth phase, but because if you understand what they're here to buy, you can more effectively position your recommendation in phase 4, the recommendation phase. But in phase 3, if you have not done an excellent job of establishing leverage without losing rapport, and then establishing rapport without diminishing your credibility, if you're bringing in a subpar score to this third phase, this is where you're going to have to paint the airplane while it's flying, because now you're going to need to increase your leverage and rapport score while you're also trying to uncover questions, or ask questions that would uncover data or intel that would allow you to increase the trust in this relationship. And if you haven't established a sufficient amount of leverage and rapport, when you go to ask these questions, they're not going to give it up as easily or as readily. And that's when most people decide to hammer with their IQ, because they start to feel insecure, they start to panic in many cases. And rather than allowing themselves to understand, oh, I didn't do enough in leverage and rapport, which is why this third portion here is difficult right now, and then know how to course correct and recover, they start to pummel this person, the prospect, with their IQ, which is only going to create more of a chasm or more distance between you and the prospect. So a couple of key things to understand is, you need to learn how to be effective at establishing your credentials without being off-putting. Number 2, you need to be able to establish rapport without turning everything into a bromance. Ideally, you're coming into phase 3 with an equal amount of leverage and rapport, or something that is just, commensurate. They're close, they're within range. The reason that's important is because when you establish leverage in excess of rapport, people resent you. When you establish rapport in excess of leverage, you have a extended bromance, which leaves you thinking that you're doing better than you actually are, meaning as it relates to the sale, when in fact, this person has just decided that they really like you, but they really don't have any intention at this moment. Doesn't mean it can't be recovered, but at this moment, they have no intention of doing business with you, but they're giving you all the indicators of interest because they are interested, just not in you as something that someone with whom they'd want to do business. They like you though. So when the rapport is established in excess of the leverage, which is what a lot of great salespeople do, because they tend to be outgoing, extroverted, funny, charismatic, and that has gotten them to a certain level previously in sales, but it won't take you to the next level. So understanding, how do I establish leverage and rapport within a range so that I don't have this big gap between the two, which always has a consequence. So now if I go into this third phase with too much leverage but not enough rapport, they're going to be resenting me but listening. If I go in with too much rapport but not enough leverage, in the trust phase, they're going to be thinking like, when can we go get another beer? Not really wanting to listen to you in the context of business, because that is not what they've decided is your lane. So that's why I say you have to learn to be able to paint the airplane while it's flying. But in order to paint the airplane while it's flying, you have to know that these 4 phases are no different than the law of gravity. The law of gravity exists whether or not you want to honor it. If you step out on a 33-floor building, story building, and you decide to jump and you are ignorant of the law of gravity, it's not going to save you because of your ignorance. And inside of a consultative selling environment, the same thing is true. Meaning, just because you don't know that these 4 phases are critical, that doesn't mean that these laws will spare you. It means you will suffer. But now, if you understand that these phases are like laws, if you begin to understand them and master them, you can use them, right? And not be used by them. So we've got leverage, rapport, and then the trust phase, which is that third phase. Inside of that third phase, this is where you want to bring all EQ and save your IQ for the pitch. So during phase 3, the relationship phase, so in a consultative selling environment, this is where you would be engaging in some kind of an interview, some kind of an intake, some kind of discovery, a fact finder. During this phase, this is where you need to be interested in uncovering their pain, uncovering their values, uncovering how they're going to object to you in the future, and beginning to ascertain what are they buying today, rather than being interested in what you're selling. As you begin to collect that data, what's important is that the person or the prospect that you're with is feeling more and more bonded and attached to you, not as some weird form of manipulation or some odd, weird thing that you've learned at some strange conference, just a fact of life, right? In this third phase, they want to trust you. And in order to trust you, ironically, what we found is that people will trust you more when they've disclosed more to you about that which is important to them. A lot of times we have this backwards. We think if we just talk a lot and tell them how important we are and how special we are and how qualified we are, they'll know they can trust us, and that will build trust. And that again would be more IQ. We want to save that for the 4th phase. So in this 3rd phase, you're listening deeply, you're probing, you're not probing arbitrarily, you're probing for values, objections, and pain. And then the combination of those things will tell you what this person is buying today. Your bedside manner, so to speak, in this interaction is going to dictate the degree to which they feel connected, attached, bonded to you in this interaction. I want to be clear that during this phase, them feeling attached to you or bonding with you is not going to be the same for everyone. So if I'm a touchy-feely prospect, then that's the lane that you as consultative salesperson want to meet them in, right? If I'm more of a reserved cerebral character, you can still connect deeply with me, but that bond is going to look different than the touchy-feely prospect. So understand that when we talk about establishing trust in this 3rd phase, we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all approach. Trust and deep questions means I do it the same way every time. No, it means just as if you were going to host a dinner party and you knew there were going to be, vegans in attendance, you wouldn't serve ribeye, right? If you were hosting a dinner party and there were hardcore meat eaters there, you wouldn't be serving vegan specialties, right? So the same is true here, but we're now just speaking about in an emotional context, that when you are engaged in this 3rd phase, you're really looking at how does this person communicate? What's the style of their communication? And how can you meet them and their emotional tone effectively in that moment? That's what would have them bond to you. So it's not a one size fits all. But what is consistent is that you need to be looking for pain, values, future objections, and then have that also share the narrative of what they're buying. Once you combine establishing credibility, establishing rapport, establishing trust, you're now entering into the fourth phase, which is the recommendation phase. And what you would be bringing into that recommendation phase would be a recommendation that aligns with their pain, that you position in terms of their values, and that you've already addressed the known objections before you give the formal pitch. I always say you never pitch into a field of landmines, right? So during discovery, or that third phase, the relationship phase, you should be uncovering how they're going to object to you in the future. Before you go into that fourth phase, you need to be softening or extinguishing those objections before you go and pitch. You don't pitch into a field of landmines. But in order to know where the landmines are, you need to be proactively looking for those objections in discovery, not contracting from them, not scared of them, and certainly not knowing what to do with them, right? In sales, often we feel like an objection is a bad thing. And not as just a way of reframing it. I have found that the best sales that I've had always include objections. It's the quality of the objection and the timing of the objection that dictates typically whether this is someone who's interested. Because if I'm sitting in the buyer chair, right, as a prospect, if I'm legitimately considering doing business with someone, I will typically have what could occur for them as an objection. That's because I'm engaged. If I'm not engaged and I'm pretending to be interested, I'm sitting up vertically, smiling and breathing, giving you the impression that everything that you're saying is right on the money. Typically what that means is I'm going to go MIA on you as soon as we get out of this interaction, or I'm going to find a polite way to blow you off. So the other thing is the mindset in that third phase, the relationship phase, which is you're looking for objections, not looking to create them, but you are looking to uncover them. You're willing to confront them because you know you have enough mastery to overcome those objections, right? All of that happens with training. It's not a mind, trick, right? It's not a Jedi mind trick. It's actual training. But you're looking for those objections. You're resolving those objections at the right time, but before the pitch. And then when you go into the pitch or the fourth phase, your pitch is a direct hit at their pain, meaning it's a solution for their pain, positioned in alignment with their values, having already handled objections before I'm making this pitch. And it always aligns in some way, shape, or form with what it is they told me they were buying during discovery, meaning I'm going to sell what I want to sell, but it's always going to include what they told me they're buying. I'm not going to hear what they're buying. And let's say they say they're buying oranges and all of a sudden I'm selling them apples. I need to find a way that is honest and has integrity, that addresses what they're buying, meaning what they say they're wanting and needing, along with my solution. Quite often I see recommendations where the record scratches. If I sit in the discovery phase and I listen to what the prospect is sharing, and imagine a split screen, on the left side, I hear what they're saying. Then on the right side, I watch the pitch. It seems like the person pitching is either suffering from serious amnesia or a hearing condition, or some way that there's an absolute disconnect between what this person said they were buying and what you're selling. So that fine balance of uncovering pain, understanding values, understanding what it is that they believe that they're buying, and finding a way to have these things synchronize in your recommendation so that you're making an ask that is appropriate. As we take a look at an appropriate ask, it's very important that you imagine 4 scales. There's the leverage scale, there's a rapport scale, there's a trust scale, and then there's the ask or the recommendation that you're going to make. You have a score on all of these scales, whether you know it or not. Your ask at the end or recommendation cannot exceed the cumulative score that you've earned on leverage, rapport, and trust. Ideally, you have earned leverage, rapport, and trust in excess of the ask that you're going to make, or at a minimum commensurate with that. If you are making an ask that exceeds your leverage, rapport, or trust, you're setting yourself up to not close. But in order for you to know, well, how do I know how much leverage, rapport, and trust I've established in relationship to the ask? This is where the art of really understanding leverage inside and out, understanding rapport inside and out, the indicators. How do I know if I've increased rapport just visually by looking at this person? How do I know how much leverage I have? All of this would be validated by the questions that you would intentionally ask during the relationship phase. And the degree to which you have mastery over these subjects would allow you to understand, as you ask these questions, the degree to which you have a sufficient amount of leverage, rapport, and trust to make the ask that you're going to make in the recommendation phase. When you take a look at all four of these phases and you think about why it is certain people are not closing, what you want to understand is problems show up in the phase after where you are deficient. So for example, let's say somebody is finding that they're really getting hammered in the relationship phase, meaning they're not effective there. The way you know that you're not effective is you're asking questions you should be that are getting more and more invasive. And this person is becoming more and more introverted, or they're contracting more, right? They're getting stingier with their responses. When that's happening, a lot of people assume, oh, I need to get better at discovery, which is probably never a bad assumption. But the reality is it's typically because you failed at rapport. And when you're finding it difficult to establish rapport, it's typically because you are subpar at establishing leverage. So you get punished, meaning the indicators of punishment don't show up and arise until the phase after the phase that you suck at. And that's what is important for you to understand, because a lot of times people think I'm not closing. Let me work on closing. When in fact, what you need to work on is the phases that came before the close, because that's what's priming or destroying the condition that you and the prospect are in by the time you go into close. So with all of this in view, the bottom line is EQ has, or emotional intelligence, first and foremost, level one is understanding these four phases, understanding the art of leverage, the art of rapport, the art of trust, and then how all three of those skills combine to have someone be either receptive or not receptive to your recommendation in that fourth phase. So that is to say that if someone has a high degree of emotional intelligence, they not only know that these phases exist, they know how to operate inside of each of these phases. They understand the indicators of whether or not they're getting it right or not with different prospects. And they have the versatility and the agility to create leverage and rapport and trust and a recommendation that others would be receptive to with people from different walks of life. They're not limited to one lane. That's called being good at that niche. That doesn't mean you understand these skills. These skills should be transferable. So EQ, first and foremost, is the ability to use these four phases effectively so that you can close more ideal clients, and not only close the client, but at the close have established a deeper bond than, say, your competitor, who may also get the close but doesn't have that cumulative score. Because the first close should be the invitation to subsequent closes or more referrals, more business. And if I'm coming into this close and I have just enough to close them, that means somewhere along the way, I don't understand the art of these four phases. And that means the next ask that I should be able to make is where I will get punished. So EQ is knowing these phases, knowing how to use them, not just with a niche, but across many different walks of life, and then understanding how to course correct and recover, as I say, paint the airplane while it's flying, while you're moving through these phases. When you see that you're having difficulty with a prospect, you understand in that moment, you can spot what happened and you know where to correct. All of that will show up as emotional intelligence. And that would be what I would refer to as phase 1 of emotional intelligence. So if you're having difficulty closing that ideal client and you feel like you've given them all of this evidence about why it is you would be the best match for them, understand that that evidence is typically IQ driven. And until you address their pain, their objections, their values, and what they're buying, all of the evidence in the world that you're the right person, continuing to pummel them with that information is not going to result in a close. More emotional intelligence will allow you to get the answer key from them, the emotional answer key and the cerebral answer key, that will make the close much easier, and not only get the close, but deepen the relationship. So once again, I would suggest that you bring a lot of EQ into the first 3 phases. And once you've established that in abundance, then people will be receptive to that 4th phase, which is the recommendation phase, when you bring your IQ. I hope this makes a difference for you guys. I welcome all of you to continue to email in questions. You can email them into info@kellygroup.intl.com. It's an honor to be here. It really is so much fun. This is my 2nd successful live, meaning successful. I got on and finished it. And again, I hope that this makes a difference for you. As I mentioned to you last time, I had a mentor who I would watch every Wednesday for many, many years. He and she made a huge difference for me. And if I could only do a modicum of that for others, it would be really meaningful to me. So I hope to see you guys next Tuesday. Thanks for showing up, and remember to bring a lot more EQ. Have a great rest of your week, guys. Bye-bye.